Hi everybody, welcome to this NatCen ESS City University webinar. I'm delighted to welcome Cornelia Neuert from GESIS, Leibniz Institute for the Social Sciences in Germany, to talk about how to conduct cognitive interviewing online. Cornelia is going to talk for about 40 to 45 minutes, and then at the end we'll take questions. If you want to post questions during the presentation, you're more than welcome to use the Q&A function, which if you're joining on a laptop, you can find at the bottom of the screen, and we'll take questions at the end. So without further ado, let me hand over to Cornelia. Thank you.
Thank you, Debbie. I will. I think I'm no. Now it works. Sorry. I hope you can now see my slides.
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Thank you, Debbie. Thank you for this nice introduction. It's a pleasure for me to present some of my work here at this seminar series today. And in this talk, it will be about conducting cognitive interviews in an online environment using the method of web probing. But let me start with the question, why test or why pretest questions at all? So the quote of Sutman and Bradburn well answers this. They say, even after years of experience, no expert can write a perfect questionnaire. If you do not have the resources to pilot test your study, don't do the study. So no expert can indeed write the perfect questionnaire simply sitting in their office. And because respondents' experiences and attitudes are too diverse to come up with a perfect question right away. So what is survey pretesting? As I said, only with the help of empirical testing is it possible to check whether survey questions actually measure what they are supposed to measure. And the term survey pretesting broadly refers to evaluating or testing a questionnaire before it is administered in the actual survey. So the ultimate goal of a pretest is to optimize a questionnaire before its use in the field to ensure that it gathers high quality data. So pretests are an essential part of the questionnaire design process. And drafting survey questions is only the first step. You must then carefully assess how good the questions are and revise them as necessary. So survey researchers have various pretesting methods at hand to choose from, like, for example, expert reviews or behavior coding. And in this talk, I would like to focus on the method of cognitive interviewing and possibilities to conduct cognitive interviews online using the method of web probing. I will briefly talk about key aspects of cognitive interviewing and then focus on web probing as the pretesting method. And we will talk about the strengths and weaknesses compared to more traditional in-person cognitive interviewing, and also on how to implement web probing efficiently and successfully. But let's start with a brief introduction to the method of cognitive interviewing. Here is a definition by Beatty and Willis that, in my opinion, sums up the practice of cognitive interviewing quite nicely. Cognitive interviewing entails administering draft survey questions while collecting additional verbal information about the survey responses, which is used to evaluate the quality of the response or to help determine whether the question is generating the information that its author intends. So that means that respondents don't just answer the questionnaire itself, but they answer questions about the questionnaire, usually in the form of a conversation. And cognitive interviewing aims to get insights into what is known as the cognitive process of survey response with 4 stages. Comprehension, so how do respondents interpret questions? How do they retrieve relevant information? how do they arrive at a judgment about what to answer? And finally, how do they map their personal internal answer to the answer categories provided? And problems with the question or with the questionnaire may occur in any of these stages. So respondents may misunderstand a word or the whole question. They may also well understand the question, but may not be able to retrieve relevant information, or they may have difficulty finding the right response or arriving at a final judgment. And what we as a researcher want to ascertain is that all respondents understand the questions the same way, that all questions are understood the way they were intended to be, and that questions are easy to understand and also easy to respond to for respondents. To give you an example of how cognitive interviewing works, the question we tested in our cognitive lab was, I feel more like a citizen of the world than of any other country. And respondents were asked to answer it on a 5-point scale ranging from strongly agree to strongly disagree. The question that we tested was taken from the module on citizenship of the ISSP, the International Social Survey Program. And we tested respondents' understanding of the term citizen of the world. And what we found was that only 2 out of 20 respondents said that they do not know what the term citizen of the world refers to, or that they are unsure about the meaning. The other participants selected an answer from the response scale without indicating that anything might be unclear. When we actively probed respondents and asked them to tell us how they understand the term, it turned out that further 5 respondents interpreted the phrase wrongly. They interpreted it in the sense of human being. So respondents, for example, said, for me, citizen of the world refers to all human beings being on Earth. Or everyone who lives on Earth is a citizen of the world. And all of those 5 respondents selected the answer categories strongly or rather agree. And with this, the proportion of people feeling like citizens of the world would probably be overestimated with this item if it is asked the way it was tested in the pretest. So how can this be explained? Usually respondents are not asked to or expected to express problems they have when answering questions. And for this reason, it is important to actively pre-test questionnaires and ask respondents questions about the survey questions. So how to conduct cognitive interviews. Here, let us discuss the steps of cognitive interviewing in more detail. Conventional cognitive interviewing, meaning face-to-face cognitive interviewing, usually takes place in a cognitive lab. That means not under regular field conditions. And the interviews are usually conducted one-on-one and only with a small number of respondents. As you've seen in my example, we had 20 respondents in this pretest. And respondents are also briefed about the setting as being a pretest, meaning that we tell them that this is a pretest and their task is it to help us to improve the questionnaire and to indicate if they have problems with questions. I have to say that there's not one standard way of carrying out cognitive interviews, but usually the following 3 steps guide the interview procedure. So first, participants answer the question to be tested, just like they would in a usual interview, or if this was the final questionnaire. And while they are doing this, the cognitive interviewer observes any unusual reactions that might occur. So if someone looks confused, or if they hesitate or show any signs of difficulty. And respondents can also be encouraged to verbalize their thoughts while answering. This is the technique is called think aloud. You might have heard about it. And when the question has been answered, the interviewer asks specific follow-up questions to understand how respondents decided on their answer and what they were thinking while answering. And these follow-up questions are called probes. And the main goal of think aloud probing is to gather specific information about respondents' understanding of terms, the whole question, or also the answer categories, and about the process that respondents took to arrive to their answer. And an alternative and rather new method to conduct cognitive interviews is to implement the probes into an online questionnaire. And this method is called web probing. And yeah, in particular, in times of COVID-19, this proved to be a great alternative, although, of course, it was also possible to conduct face-to-face interviews in a remote setting. But yeah, web probing is a great alternative when you do not have access to respondents. But yeah, what is cognitive online pretesting or web probing? Web probing is defined as the implementation of probing techniques from cognitive interviewing in web surveys. So that means we ask open-ended or closed probes as follow-up questions to survey questions within a web environment. And thereby we can use the same probing techniques like in face-to-face cognitive interviewing. And as you can see on the slide, the probes can be formulated as an open-ended probe or as a closed probe. And when asking open-ended probes, then the aim is to use the open-ended answers to evaluate whether the survey questions consistently measure what they are supposed to measure. So you try to get the same answers or results like you would in a conversation, in a typical face-to-face interview. Yeah, on this slide, I have just listed several variants of probing with example wordings. And in principle, you can ask the same probes like in cognitive interviews, and you can also implement them in the online context. However, there are some specifics to consider in the online context. But let's first also look at a concrete example for web probing so that you get more familiar with the method. Here you see the target question on this slide. And the target question was a single question asking, taking everything into account, how satisfied are you with the democratic institutions in our country? And respondents were shown 5 response options. They were presented vertically and ranged from completely satisfied to completely dissatisfied. And here you see some or 2 alternative probing variants. These are 2 typical probe questions in an online mode. The one is a comprehension probe and the other is a category selection probe. And comprehension probes ask respondents to define how they understand a certain term or what they have in mind when they see a certain term, what they associate with it. And an example would be in this question, what do you understand by democratic institutions? And then respondents would be asked to define what they have in mind when thinking about democratic institutions. The second example is a category selection probe. And here respondents are asked for their reasons for having chosen a specific response category. So for example, if you have answered that you are completely satisfied with the democratic institutions, then yeah, you would be asked to explain this answer a bit further. And usually answers to category selection probes take the form of a short argumentation. Yeah, in comparison to face-to-face cognitive interviewing, web probing has several benefits, not only during pandemic, but in general. So for one, web probing facilitates recruitment of respondents, as it is possible to use a service provider for this purpose. And data recruitment is also relatively fast, or faster than when conducting face-to-face interviews. And web probing also allows to recruit respondents with a broader geographical coverage. And you can also include more distinguished quotas, for example, in terms of age groups, employment status, or other relevant characteristics. A second benefit is that the self-administered survey mode, yeah, kind of guarantees standardization of probing, and also rules out any interviewer effects. So in usual face-to-face interviews, the experience of the interviewer or the interviewing style plays a role, and in the self-administered survey mode, yeah, you do not have these interviewer effects. And also there's no need for transcriptions of interview sessions and verbal data. So the answers respondents type in to the text boxes, they can be exported in Excel files or other files. And yeah, finally, findings from web probing can be quantified. So you often have a sufficient sample size to have a good idea of response distributions and also on themes found in probing. And this also helps you to prevent false positive findings. Of course, the method also has some disadvantages compared to face-to-face cognitive interviewing. The first corresponds to the pretesting mode, because you as a researcher or as the interviewer are restricted in the probing questions you can ask. So the probes have to be implemented into the web survey in advance. And yeah, because there's no interviewer present, you or the interviewer cannot follow up on incomplete answers or ask additional probing questions when you would be interested in more information, or when more information would be needed to understand whether the question was understood as it was intended to be. And also it might turn out that your probing question is not understood as intended, and then usually you would rephrase it and ask it in some other words, or try to use another probe. But yeah, in web probing you are less flexible and cannot react on such events, and it's not possible to change or amend the probes during field time. So for that reason, the wording of a probe requires specific attention. So it is important to be as precise as possible in the formulation of the probe. And a general recommendation also would be to avoid to address more than one topic within a probe. So if you have different topics you would like to address, then ask different probes for the topics. With regard to response quality, the absence of an interviewer may lead to a lack of motivation among respondents, and answering open-ended questions always increases or often increases the burden of respondents as they have to type in their answer and cannot just select one of the responses. And as a result, the non-response rate is often higher in web probing studies. So in generally, the answers fall out shorter in comparison to face-to-face cognitive interviews. And there's also a higher number of answers that you are not able to interpret or which are incomplete. And you do not have that. Usually you do not have that in face-to-face cognitive interviews. And finally, although it is beneficial to have a higher number of respondents and also to have a high number of responses to your probe questions, more open answers also require or also mean higher effort in data analysis. So coding of open-ended responses makes the analysis time and labor intensive. So that's also what you should have in mind. But how comparable are the two methods? In two studies that we conducted here at GESIS, we could show that there's an extensive overlap between the results of face-to-face cognitive interviewing and web probing. And in both studies, we found that both methods found very similar problems with questions and also lead to the same suggestions for item revision. And here's an example from the study I conducted together with my colleague Timo Lenzner. And in this study, we compare, the findings of respondents drawn from a non-probability online panel with the results obtained in our lab via face-to-face cognitive interviewing. And in the face-to-face interviews, we conducted interviews with 20 participants. And for the web probing, we had a sample size of 500 respondents. And the question we tested was how important is it that citizens may engage in acts of civil disobedience when they strictly oppose government actions? And for comparing the two modes, we asked two types of probing questions. One comprehension probe, that was what does the term civil disobedience mean to you? And the second probe was a general probe that asked respondents to elaborate a bit more on the answer option they selected. And as you can see here in the table, cognitive interviews and web probing identified the same problems. We found that the term civil disobedience was unfamiliar or undefined for some respondents. For some, it was associated more with violent behavior. And another finding was that the response scale was interpreted as reaching from non-violent to violent behavior instead of importance. And as you can see in the table, we also found, although we found similar problems or the same problems, the method showed some differences with regard to the prevalence of problems. And for example, while 30% of the face-to-face cognitive interview respondents said that the term civil disobedience was unfamiliar to them, only 5% did so in the web survey. This might be due to the fact that participants in the face-to-face setting often spontaneously comment on an item before answering any probing questions. So some participants just said that they were unsure about the term or did not know what it means. And in the web probing setting, respondents had no opportunity to tell us something spontaneously, and were thus more focused on just answering the probing questions. But beside of that, the same problems were detected for the questions we tested, and led to the same recommendations for revising the questions. So an important aspect to consider when using open-ended probes is that similar to open-ended questions, as I said, the demand on respondents or the burden is higher when they answer open-ended questions compared to closed questions. So open-ended responses need to be written in a text box, and respondents cannot use the answer categories that have been provided. So general research on open-ended questions shows that the proportion of people who do not give an answer or do not type anything into a text box is much higher than with closed questions. And accordingly, the challenge for us is to design and implement questions in a way that maximizes the quality of the answers. And not only the content, but also the expected scope of the answers should be clear to the respondent. And it's therefore recommended to indicate to the respondent already with the size of the text box what level of detail you are expecting from them. So this means if the researcher would like to respond or would like the respondent to provide more like a short essay, for example, in general probe or in a category selection probe, then the text box should be larger. And if you're just expect a short statement or a short definition, then it would be fine to have or this should be indicated by a smaller text box. So if you are just interested in keyword-like statements, for example. And as I said before, if you are interested in two different topics or you have like positive and negative aspects, then it is better to ask two separate probes. With regard to the placement of probes, the recommendation is to place a probe on a separate screen. This is just to keep the response process for the open-ended probe distinct from the response process for the closed-ended target question that you intend to probe. And when you have multiple probes that follow on one target question, they can be presented in different ways. So you can choose to present them on separate pages called paging design. So you have the question to be tested on the following page, the first probe, and on the subsequent page, then the second probe. Or you can present it in a on the same page called scrolling design. So you have one further survey page with two probes on it. And in the paging design, each probe is, as I said, shown on separate pages, and respondents see how many probes and what types of probes are asked only after clicking through the pages, while in the scrolling design, the probes are presented together on one page, and here respondents need to scroll depending on the screen size, but see all probes on one page. So in this scrolling design, the information is, or there's more information on one screen, which might increase the complexity, but respondents see all information right away. And we compared these two designs in an experiment with regard to data quality of the responses and also with regard to dropouts. And yeah, our preliminary findings suggest that multiple open-ended probes should be presented on separate pages following the survey questions, like in the paging design. In the paging design, we found the lowest non-response rate compared to the scrolling design, while yeah, we did not find any differences across designs for the other quality indicators. In terms of probe presentation, you should always try to make the response task as easy as possible for the respondent. And here my colleague Dorothy Baer and other colleagues have studied how probing questions should be presented. And they recommend to repeat the context of the question along with the probe on one page. So this means that you state both the question text of the survey question being tested and also the answer option the respondent selected. And this allows respondents to fully concentrate on the content of the probe, and they don't have to go back to the previous survey page if they are unsure what the target question was, or yeah, this will help to help them to redrive the answering process. Sorry, this slide is in German, but I will tell you what you should take from the slide. So for questions with numerical scales, it is also recommended to repeat the labels of the endpoints of the scales to avoid any confusion. So in this example, it is said your answer was 3 on a scale from 1 to 7, and then you would, or it's recommended to repeat that 1 means not at all important and 7 means very important, for example. What has also been found from my former colleague Katharina Meitinger and also Michael Braun and Dorothy Baer is that when your study includes identical probes, for instance, several category selection probes, and you have the same layout and the same text box size, then this may lead to habituation effects among respondents. So respondents may then not read the probe text of different probes and just think that that's the same probe again. And it's therefore important to carefully reflect on the sequence and the design of the probe. So if you have different probe types, it might be a good idea to also change like the layout. And you will find all the references of the studies I refer to at the end of the presentation. So if you are interested in more details on the studies. In another study, together with my colleague, Timo Lenzner, we also tried to explore the question of what is the maximum number of probes you can ask in a cognitive online pretest. And we investigated whether the number of open-ended probing questions asked has an effect on the quality of the responses and also on the depth of respondents' answers. And to do this, we varied the number of open-ended probes that respondents received. And we had a questionnaire that consisted of 26 questions in total. And respondents either received 13 probing questions in the short version, or they received 21 probing questions in the long version. So a lot of probing questions. And to compare the differences in response quality, we looked at several indicators. So for example, the amount of probe non-response, the number of dropouts, but also number of words respondents typed in response to the probes, and also how respondents evaluated the survey overall in the end, and how many number of topics they mentioned. And yeah, the findings showed that asking a greater number of open-ended probes is possible and does not necessarily undermine the quality of respondents' answers. So we did not find differences for the indicators amount of probe non-response, number of uninterpretable answers, number of dropouts, number of words or response times, and also the number and type of themes covered by the probes was identical or not different. And also the number of probes being asked did not affect the respondent satisfaction with the survey. However, we found a slightly higher break-off rate in the condition with more probes. So respondents, or we had to, our panel provider had to invite more respondents to get the intended sample. So for pretesting study, this might mean that you have to oversample to get the intended sample size. And also, of course, the study had some limitations. One I just mentioned, we recruited respondents via an online access. So we had panelists, and these were paid for survey participation. And also the respondents were informed on the start screen that this was a pretest and that they would be asked to answer more open-ended questions and help us to revise the questionnaire. But yeah, alternative experiences or of studies without this explicit announcement of pretesting studies also worked well with 6 to 8 probes in a 50-minute survey, for example. Yeah, as I said, open-ended questions in general are more prone to non-response, and so are cognitive probes. But in contrast to closed questions, yeah, in which non-response is equal to respondents giving no answer, in open-ended questions, respondents can refuse to enter any text, but they can also enter text without any meaning or any interpretable content, so random letter combinations, for example, or they just write in don't know responses, etc. And here on the slide, you see these kind of different types of non-response. But what is important to keep in mind is that what is defined as non-response in open-ended questions always kind of depends on the research question, because it might be okay to have one word answer to a probe, and for some probing questions it might also be okay if the respondent answers I don't know, and this is a helpful answer for you, and in other probes this would be seen as a non-response response. One step to tackle non-response is an appropriate design of probes. So as I said on the slides before, make sure that the response burden is rather low. But another option is implementing so-called soft checks in online surveys. And these soft checks are used to gently remind respondents of an answer. And when using these soft checks, the survey software automatically checks whether the text box is empty or not. And if the respondent did not answer the question, then a message is displayed stating, for instance, that the question is important for the course of the questionnaire or for the researcher or the research question, And respondents can then decide to skip the question without answering by checking a box. So they can still leave the question blank, but yeah, it's a method to decrease the non-response rate. And as I said in the beginning, besides open-ended probes, you can also implement closed probes to understand how respondents answer survey items. And obviously, the use of closed probes allows or has some benefits. It allows the quantification of answer patterns and patterns of interpretation, and it reduces the costs and burden involved for you as a researcher in processing and analyzing the data, because you do not have to manually code the answers. And yeah, also the closed probes reduce the burden of respondents while answering. So therefore they are less prone to non-response. And here I would also like to present a study I conducted together with Katharina Meintinger and Dorothee Beer. And in this study, we compared open-ended and closed probes. And we compared them with regard to substantive content. So do the probes capture a comparable number of themes, and do they capture also a comparable number or type of themes? And the second indicator were to compare non-response rates. And the study was also conducted with respondents from an opt-in online panel provider, and we used quotas for sex, age, and education. And to compare the probe formats, we implemented 3 fully randomized experiments between subject experiments. And we asked respondents 3 questions on self-rated health, self-rated pain, and physical activities, and implemented either a closed or open-ended probe in response to the experiment questions. And we selected survey questions and probes which were already developed, or where the closed probes were already available, and they had been developed by Paul Scanlon and colleagues. And what we found was that both probe formats did not provide comparable results. So we found differences in the number of themes that were covered by respondents. We also found differences in the patterns of interpretation and in the number of themes that respondents mentioned when answering the probes. So the closed probes did not cover the full picture of what respondents associated with the respective survey questions. Comparing non-response, our results showed like the expected effect. There's higher rates of non-response in the open-ended format compared to the closed format, and in the format with the closed probes, we had almost no non-response. So there's a clear trade-off between covering the full picture and response burden when using either open or closed probes. And for us, or what we took from the study is that both formats have strengths and weaknesses, and you need to select the appropriate approach for your research question. So for us, it seemed that closed probes are more useful when you have a particular narrow hypothesis or prediction that you would like to test. And if you can formulate a probe and the respective response categories to study this specific issue, because you have to come up with the response categories yourself. And when the objective is more general, or when you are interested in the full breadth of interpretations, then like in often in cognitive interviewing, when you would like to know what respondents associate with the question, then implementing open-ended probes seems to be more appropriate. And with this, I want to close the talk, although there are still open-ended questions regarding the optimal design of web probing studies. And here are the slides. And thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Cornelia, for a really interesting presentation. There are some questions in the chat, which I'll read out to you. So there's a question from Jochin Registered. Could you share some information on how to go about sampling for cognitive interviews? It seems like a pretty important aspect.
Yeah, usually in or it's a rule for both cognitive interviewing in an in-person way, but also for cognitive interviewing in an online mode. You do not have probability samples, but you have to select your respondents based on the purpose of the study or key characteristics that are relevant for your study. And this is what you need to have in mind. So you would always try to mimic the survey population in a way, or you would, or often it's also good to oversample respondents that might have problems with the questionnaire or that are kind of more difficult to address with questions. So to give you an example, if you have a survey on information technologies stuff and questions, then you will get more out of interviews with older people or people who are not so familiar with this technical stuff, or than with younger people who use this every day, for example. So it's a purposive sampling strategy you would probably follow.
Great, thank you. So there's a question from Bessel. Is cognitive interviewing and web probing the only way to validate survey questions or certain terms within them as a quantitative method? Is it not common to use it for testing the qualitative approaches as well? I'm not sure what that last bit means, but maybe the first part, is this the only way to validate survey questions?
No, it is not. There are a lot of techniques, and for pretesting projects, we would often recommend to have or to use more methods. So you would probably start with an expert review, having questionnaire design experts reviewing your questions, and then you would try to get some information from actual respondents via, for example, cognitive interviewing or web probing or focus groups. There are also, of course, field pretests where you observe response distributions, non-response rates for certain questions. So there are a lot of ways to test questions, qualitative and quantitative methods.
Great,
and you have to choose the right method for your research intention.
Thank you. Somebody has asked whether it's possible to have a copy of your slides. I don't know whether it's possible to put a link in the chat box, but a recording of this session will be available, and I don't know whether, Cornelia, you'll be able to make your slides available that we can share with people afterwards.
I could definitely share them. I don't know whether maybe it's an idea to put it below the video on YouTube, or I don't know.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
This
we'll make that happen so that
okay,
people have a copy of the slides.
Yeah.
Thank you. So a question from Keith Meadows. Gordon Willis defines cognitive interviewing as either reparative, so you inspect and repair, or descriptive, where you're focusing on the cognitive processes of answering the questionnaire. Would you say the processes you've described here are reparative?
So web probing can be used at different stages in the process. So you can use it as a pre-testing method, and then you would try to repair questions or to give recommendations for improving them or revising them. But you can also use it after data collection, for example, when you have your data and are unsure whether respondents really understood the question you thought they would. And then, for example, try to figure out what happened in your survey. And yeah, I think it's like a or there are different views on what to do with cognitive interview data. Is it always to repair them, or is it just to provide the researcher with information what the question covers? And then, yeah, the researcher have to decide whether this is what they had in mind, or is within the range of possible interpretations or not. And if not, then of course, yeah, you should revise and repair the question.
Great, thank you. So there was a question from Patrick Moynihan, which relates to a slide that you showed where you were showing the comparability of, it was on civil disobedience, and you were comparing the findings from cognitive testing undertaken face-to-face with web probing online. And there was a difference of 25 percentage points in unfamiliarity with the term civil disobedience. And Patrick's question is, he says, this suggests, at least to me, a non-trivial mode gap. Would you share effective strategies or thresholds applied at GESIS to identify meaningful mode differences?
Yeah, so I think this is in particular, or depends of being a pretest, because in a face-to-face pretest, respondents know what will happen, and after having received some probing questions, they come up with their ideas, and also they are more focused on, or they know that when there are terms that they may not know, that I, as an interviewer, will ask them to define and or to tell me what they understand by this term. And in web probing, their respondents can what we found here is that for the term civil disobedience, we had excellent definitions of the term, and it was obvious that they were copied from Wikipedia or any other site in the internet, and then pasted into the text box. So, and then we, what would you do with an answer like that? So, it's a perfect definition, but you cannot decide whether the respondent really know what the term refers to or not. And so I think this is definitely something you need to have in mind when you have these different pre-testing methods. But as usually in cognitive interviews and in web probing studies, it's important to find indication of problems, but it's not so much how many respondents have these problems. So if there's just one person who has a really severe problem, you would try to solve it because it has a severe effects on data quality, but there can be other problems or things be identified where you say, okay, this happens a lot, but it's not that problematic for later data analysis. So I'm not sure whether this really answers the question, which is because mode effects are difficult to identify. So you will have to implement an experiment where you have both modes, but I think it's a bit different when you have pre-testing studies where respondents really are asked to tell you about the question.
So a question from Anne Moore. Is there a software tool that exists that you can use to do web probing easily?
You can use like any online software for online surveys. The only prerequisite is to have or to be able to program open-ended questions. I think that's important, but you can use any online survey software.
Great. And a question from Joe Dardenne. Do you have any insight into which method, cognitive face-to-face interviewing or web probing, is more resource intensive in terms of researcher time required?
Yeah, that's a good question. So for recruiting respondents and for conducting the interviews, web probing needs less time, so it's easier to or faster to realize. For data analysis, it really depends on the number of participants in the web probing study. So with increasing sample sizes, the coding of open-ended answers gets more timely, and so I would probably to test the same number of questions, web probing studies would need a bit less time, but the insights are maybe less deep, I would say. But I think for recruiting respondents, this always takes some time, and then respondents do not show up to the interviews, and also data. If you transcribe the interviews, this takes a lot of time, and you don't have to do that for web probing. So that's another factor that is not necessary for web probing studies. So I would say it takes a bit less time to conduct the interviews online.
Great, thank you. And a question from Jenny Parker. So her question's about probe placement. If we have 10 questions to test, what's your recommendation? What's your recommendation to ask the probe after each individual question, or to wait until someone has answered all 10 and then ask the probes with a reminder of each question?
Yeah, it's like in face-to-face interviews, it depends. So if the questionnaire is, or if it's important, if the respondent has answered the whole questionnaire and then answers the probing question, then you would probably use the alternative where you have all probing questions in the end, and you would implement that in a web environment as well. And as was said, then you would need to repeat the questions and probably also the answers given, because it's difficult, more difficult for respondents to remember then. Of course, this has disadvantages that respondents don't have in mind what they thought when answering the question. So that's the benefit of this concurrent probing technique. But there's a study from Willis and Fowler from 2020 who compared retrospective probing and concurrent probing in a web setting, and they did not find that much differences between the two methods. But I think it depends on the number of questions, the topic, whether the question relate to each other. So yeah, an idea would be to split to split your sample and have ask the one half of your sample the questions right after each target question, and the other half of the sample gets the questions in the end, and then you can compare it.
Great. Thank you, Cornelia. There were several other questions in the Q&A, but unfortunately we've run out of time, folks. So I know that some of you had wider questions about cognitive interviewing and web probing, and Cornelia's provided some references, but there's plenty of reference material out there about cognitive interviewing, how to do it, how it differs from depth interviewing, those kinds of issues. So yeah, hopefully you'll find what you're looking for there. But thank you so much, Cornelia, for a fascinating presentation.
Thank you very much.
Thanks all for joining. Take care, everybody.